Well, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Juneteenth. Welcome to Philipse Manor Hall. My name is Michael Lord. I am the site director here at Philipse Manor Hall, and I want to welcome everybody to our afternoon presentation, which is very rare here, but since y'all have the day off, figured we might as well do this. And for those who are hanging out at home, glad you've got the day off as well. Glad that we can present this both online and in person. Today's presentation, Black-Owned Farms in Early Westchester. Keith Doherty and myself are presenting in tandem this afternoon. I am the warm-up act, okay? I'm only gonna be up here for a few minutes and, I'm here all week, so you can see me anytime. But I do want to give you a quick overview anyway of today's holiday of Juneteenth and point out a little bit of the colonial era African-American history here in New York, which will lead up, I think, to Keith's presentation. So first of all, to answer the question, what is Juneteenth? In a nutshell, Juneteenth refers to the date of June 19th, 1865. Even though the Confederate Army at that point had surrendered to the Union Army, this was during the time of the American Civil War, enslaved people in Texas, the westernmost Confederate state, were not informed of their freedom until June 19th, 1865. Well, 3 months after the war ended at Appomattox. Union General Gordon Granger announced that more than 250,000 enslaved Black Americans in Texas were free by executive decree, and that's where we get the name Juneteenth from. Formerly enslaved individuals immediately sought to reunify families, establish schools, run for political office, even sue slaveholders for compensation. Now, despite more than 200 years of enslavement up to that point, these individuals demonstrated extraordinary courage and resilience as they transformed both their lives and that of the country. Initially, Juneteenth was celebrated by families, church-centered gatherings and such, but over time, the celebrations spread across the American South in the 1920s and 30s, and 2026 marks the 5th anniversary of Juneteenth as a national holiday. That's pretty cool. Now, to answer the next question, what does Juneteenth have to do with New York? That's a little more complicated, because actually very little, if you look at it, from a historical perspective anyway. Juneteenth has always been more than a holiday, however. It's a day for introspection, a platform for education, a tribute to the monumental contributions of African Americans to the history of this nation. For today's contemporary commemoration of Juneteenth, we're going to look back a little on New York's long walk to freedom. In 1627, 399 years ago, a dozen or so African captives were delivered to the settlement of New Amsterdam. They were captured from a Spanish vessel. Many of their names suggest their nationality, names such as Simon Congo, Paulo de Angola, and Peter Santome. This was a mere 2 years after the founding of New Netherlands under the control of the Dutch West India Company. And since the Dutch West India Company had no laws at this point defining enslaved labor, these individuals were considered something akin to an indentured servant. But the length of their indenture was never defined and seemed to be permanent. So slavery then began in this area as a social custom, an informal practice that had not yet been codified into law. And that was no different than, say, in Jamestown, Virginia, either, where the first African arrivals in 1619 were also considered indentured servants because Virginia at that point had no laws defining enslavement either. Under Dutch rule in the New Netherlands, this unofficial form of slavery has been referred to as a form of half freedom. It stems from a particular court case in 1644, where several of these first captives sued the Dutch West India Company for their freedom to end that permanent indentureship that they seem to have been in. The Dutch West India Company awarded these men, and they were men, their freedom. And also they awarded freedom to the wives of these men. But there were significant strings attached to this promise of freedom. Those freed men had to work their land and pay the Dutch West India Company a specified amount of produce each year to remain free. They had to volunteer time for road and bridge repair. And most importantly, it was understood that the land and the farms that they were able to purchase were situated in a place just north of the city of New Amsterdam. This is an area now in Washington Square Park and encompassing most of the NYU campus as well. Those farms were set up for these freedmen of color to serve as a buffer zone should the English colonists of Connecticut decide to invade New Amsterdam or New Netherland. But the biggest string attached was that the children of these formerly enslaved men and women, and I'll quote it, both those already in existence and those hereafter born shall be slaves. So what kind of freedom is that? If you pick up and move out of the country or out of the colony, you leave your children behind because they're enslaved to somebody else. If you move within the colony, any future children that you're going to have are going to be enslaved to somebody else. You can't be half free or half slave. This idea of half freedom is really another form of slavery. And over the next 40 years in New Amsterdam, New Netherland, and later into New York, a legal codification took place defining slavery in New York as a form of chattel or movable property where enslaved individuals could be bought, sold, bequeathed, and gifted. Families were torn apart as one could be sold to pay off a debt or given away as a wedding gift to start a new household. In New York, slave codes were aligned with the other codes of the other British colonies, so by the year 1700 or so, that legal definition of slavery was nearly identical in all of the King's colonies from Boston to Barbados. Moving ahead about 75 years, so I'm not keeping you here all day, what about the promise of freedom that came with the American Revolution? Well, in the early summer of 1776, the 13 colonies that represented the Continental Congress issued a formal declaration of independence from the King of, well, from Great Britain in general. Now, we know about Thomas Jefferson's famous words, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lofty goals. And as a country, we have struggled, I think, ever since to live up to those goals. But of course, in Jefferson's day, this idea, the term men, was a much narrower definition than we hold it today. Jefferson's notion of men is that they would be white, Christian, males, men, over the age of 21 with land and with property. So poor whites with no land or property, free persons of color, Catholics, or women didn't count in this definition of men. And enslaved men weren't considered men in the eyes of the law because they were considered somebody else's property. So neither Jefferson nor the signers of that declaration had any problem using that term men being created equal. But of the 56 men who signed this Declaration of Independence, 41 of them were slave owners. And of those 41, 40% were from the North. Those northern enslavers included, I'll give you a rundown of just a handful of them. That guy, the big one in the middle, John Hancock from Massachusetts, was an enslaver. This guy over here, if you can't read it, it says Ben Franklin. For those of you who might not know who he is, from Pennsylvania, was a former enslaver. And this is a listing of the delegates from New York and New Jersey. How many of those men were enslavers? Anybody want to guess? Anybody know? All of them. All 9 of these men were enslavers. That, I think, kind of puts it into perspective to see our country's birth certificate in this light. Our original document of freedom and independence was yet another false promise that changed nothing for the enslaved at the birth of this new nation. In 1779, however, right in the middle of the War for Independence, the British took a big step towards freeing any rebel-owned slave who could make it safely to British lines. Issued by Sir Henry Clinton, the General Commander-in-Chief of all His Majesty's forces, so he was the counterpart to George Washington. He was actually headquartered here in this building at Philipse Manor Hall when he issued what became known as the Philipsburg Proclamation. It was arguably the nation's first emancipation proclamation, even though it was issued by the British, the enemy. It guaranteed freedom to any rebel-owned slave who could make it to British-held territory, not just those who could fight, but any man, woman, and child who could run and find safety behind British-occupied territory. The British did not offer this freedom for humanitarian reasons. They were also enslavers themselves, but they understood that such a disruption of American labor and the threat of losing their private property might keep other Americans from siding with the rebels. Now, despite losing the war, and I'm sorry if I spoiled it for you, but yeah, they lost the war, the British did keep their promise to free those who ran to the crown. Americans protested bitterly, including even General Washington. But when the last British soldiers sailed out of New York Harbor in November 1783, an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 ex-slaves left with them. Ironic how freedom and liberty meant siding with the Loyalist cause during the American Revolution. Now, while the Philipsburg Proclamation might not have been issued with an altruistic eye towards ending slavery, the effect of its terms were undeniable. It offered enslaved individuals and their families a credible choice between the vague promises of American liberty and the practical policy of British freedom. It should be no surprise that thousands of enslaved individuals found the Philipsburg Proclamation to be their Declaration of Independence. Now, gradual emancipation in New York began on July 4th, 1799, 23 years after America's Declaration of Independence. All newborns born after July 4th, 1799 would be born free. But any child born prior to that date, July 3rd, 1799 or earlier, remain enslaved for life. To appease members of the New York legislature, because many of them were also enslavers themselves, the assembly required that those freeborn born after July 4th, 1799, were required to serve their mother's master or mistress for another 25 to 27 years. It wasn't until 1817 that a bill was passed to abolish slavery in New York 10 years later, on July 4th, 1827, a full 51 years after the Declaration of Independence and a mere 34 years before the American Civil War. Now, the union of democracy and tyranny continued in the United States well after New York's gradual manumission of 1827. The document on the far right, the one that's really, really hard to read, is actually a listing of several men and women that had still been enslaved in New York into the 1840s, long after that 1827 declaration. And of course, we know that slavery continued to be legal in states below the Mason-Dixon line for another generation or so. But here up north, gradual emancipation was painfully slow. Slavery wasn't constitutionally abolished in Rhode Island until 1842. In Connecticut, it was 1848. New Hampshire, I believe it was around 1852, actually. So it still was very slow. During the American Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Abraham Lincoln took effect on January 1st, 1863. The proclamation declared, quote, that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. And despite this promise, the Emancipation Proclamation was limited, though, in many ways. It applied only to the states that had seceded from the United States, leaving slavery untouched in the border states that remained in the Union, and that was Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware. It also exempted the parts of the Confederacy that had already come under Northern control, areas like New Orleans, Tidewater, Virginia. So the only way really to free the people in the Emancipation that the Emancipation promised freedom to would be to defeat the Confederacy, which is what they had already been trying to do since 1861. That defeat did come with the surrender of General Lee's army at Appomattox in April of '65. More than 15 months after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was issued. And it wasn't until June 19th, 1865, that parts of coastal Texas heard that the Confederacy had surrendered, and that marked the end of slavery in Texas. But Juneteenth didn't even mark the end of slavery in the United States. The The Emancipation Proclamation stated that it would end enslavement only in the Confederate States. So those border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, they remained in the Union. Slavery remained legal in those states. Maryland abolished slavery in 1864, Missouri in January of 65, but Kentucky and Delaware didn't abolish slavery until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865. And then there was New Jersey. I don't know if anybody out there is from New Jersey, but let me fill you in here. New Jersey, like New York, enacted a gradual Emancipation Act that was supposed to end enslavement somewhere around 1846. But the 1860 federal census noted 44 people still listed as apprentices for life, which is another word for enslaved. Slavery's legal death in New Jersey occurred in January of 1866. After the ratification of the 13th Amendment, that's when New Jersey finally ended enslavement, because they were forced to with the 13th Amendment, a full 7 months after the Juneteenth Declaration of Freedom in Texas. So anyway, what does all of this mean, and why should any of this matter? Well, keep in mind that this country has had more than 400 years of African cultural contributions from enslavement and into freedom. A considerable part of what makes American culture comes from the continent of Africa. The Congo hands helped build this very building in the 1600s. Akan men and women plotted conspiracies and insurrections in New York City to resist their servitude. But unfortunately, Americans aren't very familiar with the many African cultures that have shaped us. Americans, don't think of our language, okay? Think of our music, our stories, our folk tales, things such as this. Simple words and slang that we know. For example, that little thing. Slang term is goober, right? Well, nguba is a West African term for the groundnut or the peanut that you see there. This woman is toting around a handbag. I couldn't find a better picture of somebody toting something. But tote is actually, in the Dogon language of Mali, tota is their verb, which means to carry. And these are American words. I don't know in England if British language uses terms like tote, unless they remember the tote bags from the 1970s and such. That wonderfully thick little stew over there is gumbo. Nguba is a West African term for the thick stew that you're looking at there. Those folks are dancing the jitterbug. And jitterbug is two different words in the Wolof languages near Senegal, jitu and bag. Jitu means fast, bag means dance. Mash them together, you got a fast dance called the jitterbug. Okay. Terms like oki are throughout West Africa, meaning yes or affirmative, right? That's been picked up. We hear lots of different ways that okay kind of came into our vocabulary, from old kinderhook to old correct. Okay, oki sort of predates all of those. This is a painting of a gathering in South Carolina around 1790. The circled highlight area is a gentleman playing the banjo. Well, there are references that Thomas Jefferson made in his diaries to slaves in Monticello playing an instrument called a banjar, which is a West African stringed instrument. In 1736, there's an article in a New York newspaper about an individual playing a banjar from Africa as well. We've got a long history of this African instrument becoming Americanized as part of what we do with music. And speaking of music, the blues, just one of many examples. The Bo Diddley beat for rock and roll, those come straight out of Africa, all right? Masks and paintings from those artists, Matisse and Picasso, are using those traditional West African masks as a way to start off their creative juices to do some of their work as well. This is Matisse's mother, and this is a Don mask from West Africa, and you can see the similarities in how he painted that image of his mother. And then there are these Anansi stories, trickster tales, of weaker animals that are using their wits to outsmart a an opponent that is stronger or more dangerous than them. Those Anansi stories, they also have stories of a goat outwitting a lion, stories of foxes that are doing the same thing, and stories of rabbits that are doing the same thing. And a rabbit is our perfect example of our 20th century trickster, Bugs Bunny. He's about as African as you can get. We just don't always recognize this. And that's important for us, because if we haven't been taught how African our American culture is, then we're missing something here. America's always been far more African than we thought it was. It is home to these stories, to this music, to these words, and to that language. And visiting an historic site, whether it's Philipse Manor Hall or some other place, provides us with an opportunity, I think, to commemorate, to contemplate, and celebrate this holiday of Juneteenth. So, with that said, I do want to thank you. I will wrap up right now. I think that we're going to leave questions till the end of Keith's presentation. So if you had actually any questions that are really getting to you right now, write them down, or use the chat box if you're looking and playing on at home. And we will have some time to answer those questions later on. But I do want to get Keith up here, because he's the guy who's really going to have the majority of that information to talk about today on Black-owned farms in Westchester. Thank you for your patience, and let's move along to the main event here with Keith Doherty.
Hi, everybody. Keith Doherty, happy Juneteenth. Thank you for coming. So the topic today is Black-owned farms in early Westchester. It's something I've been researching for several years now. It's a sort of a hidden history. What many people just don't realize, that post-abolition, or rather during gradual abolition and immediately afterwards, many free Black people were able to acquire property in various ways. This happened all over the county. Okay, here's my little map. Try to use the laser pointer function. Yeah, okay. Here's my little map. I'm showing you just a few of the communities, a few of the enclaves that existed all around the county, in Yonkers, in Harrison, in New Rochelle, and these were free Black landowning communities. These are the people that ultimately became the county's first Black middle class, the people that established the first Black churches, the people that established the first Black schools and cemeteries, and so on. Their history is almost completely not recorded. But it's through land ownership that we kind of get the key. We can see, it's a portal through which we can see the emergence of this Black bourgeoisie. Many have heard of places like Seneca Village down in Manhattan. You may have heard. That was a Black landowning settlement in what is now Central Park. But there were settlements all over the place. And these settlements were established by men and women who had been enslaved in their youth or forced into involuntary servitude if they were born after 1799, and who, upon gaining their freedom, managed against all odds to acquire land of their own and to cultivate it on their own terms for their own profit. In other words, to become entrepreneurs unto themselves. Financial independence. This was the key to future prosperity. So I'm showing you nearly all of these properties were agricultural in nature. We have to remember that the Bronx and Westchester were very much rural places. If you bought a sizable piece of property here, you were by default a farmer. Many had to supplement what they made from crops, however, because the land was usually kind of small and not very high quality with other sorts of labor, with other sorts of menial labor. So I'm just showing you a photo from 1930, and we've got a fellow called Edmund Peterson right here, and he's riding what's called a sulky, which is like a deluxe plow. It's like a riding mower. You're plowing the field, but you can sit in it, So this was deluxe stuff. And his farm, we know, lasted until at least 1920. He was on Saxon Woods Road in Scarsdale. So no doubt this man spent plenty of time in his youth in that very seat. okay? And he's demonstrating for a couple of young ones, younger bloods over here. Over here, we've got photos of some of the female members of the Purdy Peterson family. We've got two of Edmund's sister, Lydia and Idella, or Dell, on the right, and an aunt named Sarah Purdy and these are from around 1900. We're fortunate to have them. Black landowners in general did not have photographs made of themselves. This was big luxury back in 1890 or 1900. So this is a rare thing that we've got some photographs, the fact that they exist, and what they're wearing, especially the clothing that they're wearing, the spectacles. They are telling us that they belong to the middle class, that they're middle class people, that they have transcended enslavement and become full citizens of the world. So the importance of land ownership for Black people is inestimable. This is a time when freedom was still very precarious. It was still legal in the South, of course, and we had the Fugitive Slave Act, the Dred Scott decision. All of these things made the feeling of freedom, I think, very tenuous. And so institutionalized racism, overt, undisguised, was everywhere. So making real financial advancement or independence was extremely difficult, and most, especially those who lived in the city, were locked into a cycle of rent paying and the same sort of menial work they had done when they were enslaved, namely dock workers. This was sort of the primary occupation, especially for male enslaved people. Down on the docks, I'm showing you some pictures of, on the left, those are two enslaved men. They're shipwrights. They're actually repairing a ship. Okay, so these were skilled laborers. And on the right, we've got like a longshoreman type of guy who would load and unload ships. This was the kind of work that free Black men were forced to do even after abolition. The pay was terrible, and it all went to the landlord. So owning a parcel of land in a rural place like Westchester was one way to break the cycle and achieve financial independence. It was also the only way for Black men to vote. A racist provision in the newly passed 1821 state constitution required Black men to own at least $250 worth of real estate in order to cast a ballot. By contrast, all white men could vote, regardless of property ownership. This was obviously designed to eliminate Black men as a voting bloc because it was assumed that most would not own property. But those who purchased land in Westchester and elsewhere would hear none of it. They would not be denied their suffrage. And on the screen, I'm showing you one of my favorite documents. This is a tax assessment from 1843 for the town of Greenburgh, okay? And I'm showing you two Black landowners from Hastings-on-Hudson, Anthony and Peter Riker. And we can see that their property is worth exactly $250. And I see this a lot in assessments for Black landowners. That was the threshold to vote. So it's not possible to look at all of these little settlements, but I'm going to look at a few. I want to start briefly by looking at Seneca Village because it's the most famous free Black landowning community from the abolition, the period of abolition, and the best documented. It was an exceptionally, now it's underneath Central Park in 86th Street and Central Park West, but it was an exceptionally large and well-appointed place. It had 3 churches, at least 1 school, 2 cemeteries, and so on, which is extremely nice, extremely well-appointed. And we're looking at a map of Seneca Village before it was destroyed for the park on the right, and on the left, a digital reconstruction that was recently made of Seneca Village. This is what Seneca Village looks like now. People relaxing and sunbathing, okay? But once upon a time, it did look like this. So in addition to several recent historical analyses, there have been 5 archaeological excavations at Seneca Village in the last 20 years or so. And there's signage all over the place. It's a virtual outdoor museum. It shows you what you can do if you've got like unlimited resources and lots of dedicated people, you know? All right, moving on to Westchester. So the most prominent example of community of early Black landowners is certainly the Hills, something called the Hills. This is a community that evolved at the junction of what is now West Harrison and White Plains. And documenting it has been the life's work of my colleague Edith Quinn, who I hope is maybe tuning in to this lecture from afar, okay? She has documented the Hills masterfully, and this is her book, Freedom Journey, which was published in 2015. If I were teaching a course on this, this would be the first thing on the syllabus. Let's see. So a few stats on it. The highest population was about 200 to 300 in the 1860s, which is actually comparable to Seneca Village. It possessed its own church and school in the same building as at Seneca Village. It had an extensive burial ground, you know, and agriculture. So in many ways, quite comparable to Seneca Village. It is not commemorated the way Seneca Village is, however. This is what it looks like today. And what we see is extremely sort of foreboding terrain, okay? This was terrible farmland. And when I look at properties that were owned by the earliest free Black owners, almost uniformly, the quality of the land is terrible. That they were able to raise anything on these parcels is quite amazing. So it remains undeveloped. It's so bad, it remains undeveloped to this day in Westchester, where every square inch is worth like $1 million, okay? It's still undeveloped. It's extremely unaccommodating, as I said. And if it made farming difficult, the ruggedness of the terrain also protected the community from those who would do it harm. Hills residents had good reason to fear harassment and even attack. The race riots were going on in Manhattan, including the draft riots, during which some 15 Black men were lynched. Not to mention the Fugitive Slave Act and other things. The Hills was like a literal fortress of rock and stone. There was one way in and there was one way out. It was very easily defended, and the Hillsmen were no slouches with rifles. I'll tell you that, because they were hunters. The houses are all gone, although the foundations of many of them were revealed during an excavation that was carried out in 1989. The earlier ones seem to have been very rudimentary, very small, little more than shanties, really. But in time, we start seeing foundations like this one, where the stones are much larger, indicating at least 2-story buildings, 3-story buildings of the sort that you see at Seneca Village. And on the left over here, I'm showing you actual homes that were built by free Black landowners that were exceptionally successful. Fully 2- and 3-story, properly middle class. Okay. And of course, many of these properties were worth at least $250, so all of these guys were voting. Or several of them. I don't want to exaggerate. So the African church, or simply the Hills Church as it was known in the time, was built around 1845. That's very early. I think it may be the first in the New Rochelle might be a little bit earlier, but that's very early. And it was largely funded by a mortgage from a guy called Charles Purdy, who was a sympathetic white neighbor. And in general, I must say that the Hill itself as a community owes its origins to the sympathy, to the compassion of former enslavers. Many people on the east side of the county were Quakers or Methodists, and their religion, or rather their sect, really compelled them to not only free people early, I'm talking like 1790s, long before slavery was outlawed. They were freeing people much earlier than elsewhere, and they were bequeathing large sums of money and even parcels of land So a place like the Hills could not have happened without white Quaker enslavers, who were really the county's first abolitionists, and they made good on their word by granting pieces of property. Sometimes they granted money, and these men that went to the Hills and bought it, but in many cases it was granted by a former enslaver. So no picture survivor of the original church that I'm aware of, but it's described in early histories as a simple wood frame building of modest size. And I'm showing you another one from Mamaroneck that I suspect looked much like the original Hills church. And before the construction of the church, the Hills children were educated in integrated white schools. Believe it or not, schools were integrated at the time to a degree. Whether the black children received equal treatment or not is another question. But that's where the Hills children were going at first. Eventually, the church began to double as a school. We don't know if the Hills community actually opened their own school because they wanted to or because they were sort of forced to. The idea of a black school district was legalized like 3 years before they built the school, which means they could have done it 3 years earlier. So they may not have done it willingly. They may have preferred to go to the white school, but were pushed out. So it's unclear exactly how that came about. The primary physical remnant is its burial ground, known as the Stony Hill Cemetery. And I'm showing you what it looks like in 2024 when I went in the fall. And there are lots of headstones that are peeking up from leaves. Some are fancy, inscribed, well-formed, such as that of Joseph Griffin, who was a vet, served in the Civil War in the Colored Heavy Artillery E Company. Okay, that was dangerous duty. So this guy did great service. You can see the American flag. Someone remembers his service and is coming around his grave. You have some stones like that, but many of the stones look like the one on the right. They're simple, roughly formed, and uninscribed. Some of that may have to do with a lack of funds, but a lot of it may be due to Quaker beliefs. Part of the Quaker religion is that you don't have fancy grave monuments. You don't draw, it could be prideful or so on and so on. Sorry. Are you still with me? All right. So let's go to New Rochelle, shall we? All right, we're leaving Harrison. We're going to New Rochelle, going south. There was another sizable group in New Rochelle. These families, okay, and you can see there 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 that I could locate. I know that there were probably about 6 or 7 altogether. They're all sort of distributed along what is now North Avenue in New Rochelle at different points. And these people did not live in an isolated, insular community with their own church and their own school and so on. They were sort of interspersed in and among white farms and white properties. And this is actually a more common situation than you might imagine, because most of the black landowning groups were not as populous or affluent as Seneca Village or the Hills. So this sort of situation, where you've got lots of intervening white farms, is actually more common. And you've got, similar situations in Mount Vernon, Hastings, Scarsdale, and so on. And people in this situation were forced to attend integrated schools, integrated churches. It was a very different dynamic. In the case of New Rochelle, the whites that the landowners were living alongside were mostly their former enslavers. Okay? Many of these former enslavers, had given or sold portions of their own land to people that they had formerly enslaved. This happened a lot. New Rochelle was some of the most outspoken white abolitionists in the county, people like Joseph Carpenter, Hannah Pugsley. They're all, documented. And they were motivated by their Quaker faith to not only manumit early, but to bequeath money and land. And so they would take a portion of their own land and give it to someone they had formerly enslaved. And so that's why you have this situation. There were several landowning families. I've been able to fix two or three. So let's just talk about the ones that I know about. At least half of the black landowners in New Rochelle were formerly enslaved by one woman. Her name was Hannah Pugsley, and she was the most devout Quaker and the most fervent abolitionist probably in Westchester County. Her will is one of the most interesting things to read. She dedicates at least half the will to former enslaved members of her household and bequeaths hundreds of dollars to each of them. To put that in today's terms, it would be like giving $20,000 and $30,000 to each person she had formerly enslaved. So she's been documented by Barbara Davis and other people at the Westchester Historical Society, so I'm not going to go on it at length, but I do want to tell you that she left a lot of property to two people named Samuel and Sarah Serrington. They did not have the Pugsley last name. They were called Samuel and Susan Sarah. I can't say that. Samuel and Susan Serrington, okay? And they had property in what is now the Beachmont neighborhood of New Rochelle, which is one of the fanciest, ritziest places you will ever go. Each of those houses, I looked it up, and they're worth in excess of $2 million a piece, okay? But this land was originally owned by free black people, and to whom it had been given by Hannah Pugsley, although they apparently didn't hold on to it for very long. In any case, you also have, Charles Pugsley, who lived in sort of in town. Okay, if you take North Avenue to its end, you get to Huguenot Street in New Rochelle. That was the built-up kind of urban part of town. Charles was the son of a woman that Hannah manumitted. So he was sort of second generation. And he was very successful. The guy was extremely savvy, extremely smart, made a lot of money, and became really one of the black leaders of New Rochelle, and bought the land that would eventually become the AME Church. And he lived down, like I said, in the Huguenot Street area. That part of town would eventually be known as Pugsley Hollow, because in addition to Charles, you had a lot of other black Pugsleys moving in, right in around that area. I'm talking about Route 1 and Huguenot Street, right in that area. Eventually, it was all blown out for the thruway, but that's where many, many landowners lived. And then there are the Bonnets, or the Bonnets, who I have been down the rabbit hole on very, very intensely for the last 3 days. I told myself I would not spend a lot of time on the Bonnets. I could not help myself. They're extremely interesting, to me at least. They lived toward the north end of North Avenue. I found their property. It looks like that now. It's a little housing development from the 1950s. I don't have a deed, or the first black bonnet to own property was a guy called Abraham, who was formerly enslaved by the family. And he apparently had quite a bit of property, something on the order of 16, 17 acres, which is huge for a black landowner at the time. I don't have a deed or a reference in a will to it, so I can't tell you exactly when it happened, but I know that he had it because eventually he sold it. So we have a record of him selling it. Abraham also parceled bits of it off to his son Timothy and other relations. And it was all in the, like I said, at the north end of North Avenue toward Scarsdale. I want to note what really strikes me, okay, about the Bonnets, the Bonnet. I'm going to go with Bonnet, all right? The Bonnets and they were, by the way, they were Anglicans. They were not Quakers, okay? Is just how intertwined their properties were with those of their former enslavers. So this is a detail from an 1820 census of Westchester County, and I know you cannot read this very well, so I turned it into a spreadsheet for your convenience and legibility. Okay, and you can see We have white members of the family. There's no one is enslaved, and free black members of the family. And so if you read these off, and by the way, the censuses are arranged geographically. So if you read a census, you're looking at neighbor after neighbor after neighbor after neighbor. That's how it's arranged. So if these people are in a list, we know they live directly beside one another. And you've got white, someone named Jacob, who is black, black, white, black. It's an extremely sort of interwoven and intertwined. I haven't seen this anywhere else in all the other communities that I've looked at. So even well after Abraham, who was sort of the patriarch, the first one to really receive property, we see members of the Bonnet family continuing to bequeath money to Abraham's sons, Abraham's nephews, people like that. This is an excerpt from the will of Zalman Bonnet, the son of Peter Bonnet. And you can see, it says to Timothy Bonnet, colored person, forgive the archaic, expression, who resides in New Rochelle, and Sarah Bonnet, the wife of Joseph Bonnet, person residing also in New Rochelle, blah, 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 blah. I bequeath the sum of $250 each. Okay? This, by the way, is exactly the amount you would need in order to vote. I don't know if that's relevant, because I believe by 1887, the property requirement may have been removed for black men, but in any case. So this is going on over multiple generations. So this guy Zalman, he never enslaved these people that he's giving money to. He's actually not really under any direct obligation to give them money, and yet the family continues to give money to Abraham and his sons and so on. This is probably a potentially very important document when it comes to the Bonnets. It's the 1850 census, and you can see, I hope, that Abraham Bonnet is at the ripe age of 55, which 1850, that's a pretty advanced age, and he's still got several of his children are still living at home. By the time you get to 1850, census takers have got a new racial designation. It's no longer just white and black. There's a third designation, mulatto, okay? It's an archaic term, racist term, that indicates a mixed race person, a biracial person. And when we look at the Bonnets, we look at Abraham and his children, we see under the racial column, M, 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 M. What I suspect is that Abraham Bonnet is actually the son of his enslaver. He is who fathered him by one of his enslaved women. This happens very often. It's very distressing, but there's no question it was common. Obviously, they try to keep it a secret, but it explains, I think, how much money is being bequeathed to Abraham and his sons, also how closely together they are living. Also, these are Anglicans, not the type of people who would emancipate. A family relation would explain a lot of what we just saw. The Bonnet homestead was right next to something called the Carpenter Cemetery, which was a black cemetery in New Rochelle. It was established by a guy called Joseph Carpenter, who was a white abolitionist. By the 1950s, it was in great disrepair. You can see this photograph from 1957, and it's a fragmentary headstone. All we see is Bonnet and Ife of. So presumably this is a female member of the Bonnet family. And it also so happens that we have a schedule from the local undertaker of everybody who was buried in that cemetery. And there is an Abigail Bonnet on that list. I suspect that's who this gravestone belonged to. And I'm showing you a little close-up. So not only do we have Bonnets, we have Sarringtons, we have Pugsleys, okay? These are the leading lights of New Rochelle circa 1840, 1850. So when you begin to study these things and you begin to get deep into a particular municipality, you can begin to discern a whole group of people, a whole group of sort of black leaders that came together. And it's also not coincidence that several people on this list were the ones who bought the land for the first church, the Catherine AME Zion Church, which still stands today, although it's definitely not the original version. Okay, so we're going to end up, I'm going to close with a family on the Hudson, on the western part of the county. And it was an enclave, or I guess a sort of a diaspora, I don't know what word you want to use, several black properties existing on the border between Yonkers and Hastings along today's Tompkins Avenue. I want to point out the names that you've got here. There is a Warner Fields, there is a Jack Purdy, there is a Prince Griffin, and so on. All of these names are really common Hills names. Okay, Harrison and or New Rochelle names. If we can go back to the Hills for a second, okay, you can see Purdy. Purdy's owned plenty of land in the Hills, and there was also a headstone for a guy named Griffin, right? Here's a detail of downtown Harrison, and we see Fields, we see Griffin, and there are Purdys all over the place too. What I suspect is that in Hastings, you have guys who are true prospectors, guys who came from the east side of the county, came to the west side, and bought property outright, negotiated it, bought it with their own money. This is very different from being granted a piece of land by a former enslaver. These guys were hustling. They were going to the Hudson, and they were buying pieces of land. It is the case, unfortunately, and I'm from Hastings and I work in Yonkers, and I don't want this to be the case, but abolition came much more slowly on the west side of the county than it did on the east. There was no significant population of Quakers or Methodists here on the Hudson River. Instead, it was the old Dutch clans, they were the Reformed Church and the Anglican Church, and by and large, they were not interested in emancipation. And so this is why I think your black landowners on the west side of the county seem to have come from the east as opposed to the west itself. That's my big theory for the day, along with the bonnets. All right? New research, breaking right now, here. You heard it first. All right. So this Hastings is also the place where the Rikers had land. These were the people I showed you in the beginning, whose parcels were assessed at $250 a piece, exactly the amount necessary to vote. The longest lived of these farms was owned by a guy called Warner Fields. I think there should be a statue of Warner Fields. 1827 to 1925, many of these properties did not last that long. Warner Fields is really an exception. One of the unfortunate things that I've encountered when I study the life of these properties from beginning to end is that they tend to last no more than one or maybe two generations. There's a couple of reasons for that. I'm sure racism played a big role. But the other thing is farming was not a viable trade by the time you get to 1850 or 1860 in the Hudson Valley. We had been outclassed by the Midwest. And thanks to the Erie Canal, they were getting better quality crops for less money all of the time. That's Manhattan was buying from the Midwest. And so people in the Hudson Valley, especially farmers, were not making it. And so many of these farms died one or two generations in. Warner Fields held on to his property for about 100 years, even though, as I'll point out right now, the city did their best to chop it into pieces. Okay, he had a successful farm for about 12 years, and then the first big blow came, the old Croton Aqueduct, which was built through the heart of his property. You can see it right there. This is a planning map. You see Warner Fields' land is being taken for the purposes of the aqueduct. Not long afterwards, another third of his property was taken by the railroad. Okay, by the time you get to, by the time you get to by the 1860s, he is down to a single piece of property, very small, up on the northern part of it. He built 2 houses there, one of which is still standing. That also is very, very rare. Okay, this is a house that we know was built by Warner Fields. It has been doubled in size. So the left half is new, but the right half was put up by Warner Fields. And it was occupied by one of his grandsons, a guy called Theodore. I also want to point out, as my last slide of the day, this is a school roster from Hastings-on-Hudson, circa 1845. And we can read very clearly, okay, alongside lots of Irish names like Haggerty and Dunn and so on, Thomas Fields, a son of Warner, Mary Riker, and Oman Riker. These are black children. So integration happened in the 1840s. We don't think of that, but it really did. And like I said, in many communities, black landowners were forced to deal with whites and to cooperate with whites on a daily basis. And this is an example of it. So, we wonder how these communities function. You had these people who had just been emancipated, and then you have the whites around them, and they're trying to make it as business people, and white people have got to cooperate with them. And this is happening on more than you might think, from what I can tell. It's happening more than you might think. It's kind of a fascinating thing. Because when you read all the scholarship, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but yes, I am trying to toot my own horn, most of the scholarship is about emancipation, is about slavery. It's about emancipation. No one is asking the question, what happened next? What happened? What did that first generation do? This is a critical period, a hinge period. So this is what I've been endeavoring to do. Anyway, happy Juneteenth. Thank you for coming to this lecture. I hope that I have been of service today. Okay. Do you want to join?
If anyone has questions, I just ask that you speak into the microphone here so our people online can hear. I'll pass it around. Michael will pass it around.
We got one. Have you studied the Weeksville community in Brooklyn at all?
Yeah.
Was that similar to what you were talking about just now?
Weeksville is amazing because it's the only example of an urban black community. For the most part, these communities formed in rural areas because the land was cheap. Weeksville was founded by this visionary guy, Weeks, who was able to establish it in an urban context. I imagine the dynamics were similar to the other places, but the urban situation would have made it very different in a lot of ways. So, yeah, superficially, I have studied Weeksville. Yeah.
I would assume, I think that you would have to be literate to be a landowner, and no.
No.
Interesting. Okay.
And most of the deeds that I have, it's an X, and it just says Warner Fields, his mark. So, but his children would certainly have been literate. We know they were being educated in a school.
So I see when you talked about the $250 being like the minimum to be able to vote, I saw like a lot of the other land that was listed was worth more. So is it the assumption that even though it was 250, that land could have been worth a lot more than 250?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, if they could exceed 250, they did.
Okay.
I mean, Abraham Benet had land that was worth like $1,400. Which, if you do the math, translates to about like 17 acres by the prices of the day. That's huge. Yeah. So, no, there were plenty that, especially in the hills, you had properties worth 600 and 700.
And what were the products? What were they making? What were they farming?
It was a combination of wheat, potatoes, oats, and They always had a milk cow, at least one, usually had a couple of horses. So the Rikers were actually horse people. They had like a stable. They must have been selling them. And they had orchards because the land was so bad. Actually, an orchard is the only thing that will grow on a steep hillside. So there's lots of apples.
Just going along with that, we had a question online that was actually exactly the same. What did they grow? But to just push that a little further, there's a follow-up question to it, which is where and how did they sell those products that they were farming?
Yes, that is a great question that I don't know the answer to. Westchester farmers were basically growing for Manhattan. You know, all the Westchester farms, they were growing food for the Manhattan, the population of which was, you know, doubling and tripling every 10 years. So I assume that Warner Fields went down to the Hudson River because his land went right down to the Hudson River, put his stuff on a dock, put his stuff on a boat on his own dock, and took it down to the city. That's what he could grow. That's what he could grow. Most black landowners, like I said, were probably eating most of what they grew and supplementing their income in other ways, as dock workers, driving a coach, things like that. Yes, sir. I mean,
I can imagine the kind of dispossession that must have sort of ended these kind of claims to the land. In the case of some of the communities that you talked about, whether that's Warner Fields as property or Seneca Falls with Central Park. But in the case of the kind of Hills community, I'm sort of interested in what happened to the land claim, since in that case, the property was abandoned almost. And I know you kind of alluded to the how marginal that farmland was, but in terms of the ownership of that land, do you have any sense of what the kind of fate of the claim to that land was?
yes, it is owned. Most of it by the church, by the AME church that was established in 1845. So many of the landowners, I think, donated the land, transferred the title to the church. So, and that church still survives today. It's bounced around. It's currently in White Plains. It's called Mount Hope AME, but that was the Hills congregation. Originally, that was the Hills congregation.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.